Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this very first edition of a brand new StoneShare webinar. Today, we are going to be speaking about the life and death of corporate assets and what it means to have a document records management solution, whether you have one or whether you don't. And today, I am lucky enough to have with me our very own Nick Kellett, who is the CTO at StoneShare and the man that knows everything about SharePoint. Nick, how are you doing today?
Well, after that lead-in, I guess I'm feeling a bit of pressure, but very well, thank you.
Remember, you're not an actor. You're a movie star.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So today, what we're going to do is let's talk about, I guess, the world as we know it. So I think that's the first thing. Let's set the stage. If we talk about document records management, I think there's a lot of maybe trepidation even that goes along with this, in the sense that, you know, we have people that deal with some type of document records management every day. So whether that be, you know, what people used to know as big filing cabinets full of paper and files, or it could be an IT scenario. And then now we're also adding this new factor into the mix, which is all of this scenario of complying with legal standards on top of the usual kind of scenarios. So, Nick, if you could just give me a bit of background as far as what you see on that everyday scenario of how, you know, people deal with sort of document records management and the life that they lead within this kind of ecosphere, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you raised a good point there, that definitely a lot of organizations don't really feel that they have a document or records management system, but in fact they do. They probably have several. They have, you know, the filing system that they store their paper copies in, or send off to you know, to a shredding company or a storage company. They have their emails where they try to find their files and share their files with people. This is how they often collaborate. They have the filing systems on their actual computers or on network drives, where they sometimes have team drives and personal drives. And they're trying to organize and keep track of all this information, which is really a struggle. And the challenge too is that they understand that they need to manage this a little better. They understand all the pain points around how difficult it is to find things, and how they're concerned about security and whether things are being shared appropriately. More and more now that we have a lot of electronic documents, in some cases we have decades worth of documents that are on computers, there's issues with legal compliance. I mean, maybe an e-discovery request is going to come in, you know, for a legal matter, or maybe there's an access to information request for some of our government customers. So all of these organizations that we talk to understand that they need a better system than they have. They're very intimidated often because they don't know really how to start. I mean, there's technology considerations, there's challenges around information management, they're worried about whether they're compliant with certain standards. They don't know how to migrate. They're worried about the storage capacity, whether security is going to be there. They don't know what to do with their emails. And ultimately, they really don't know how expensive it would be to upgrade, how long it would take to achieve this. And they do know that it's going to affect entirely the way they and their colleagues work, the whole business. So it's really, sometimes there's a lot of pressure and a lot of fear about how to proceed.
Well, let's talk about some of those. Now, you brought up some interesting points there. And let's talk about the risk that is involved with this, because it's, I think, one of the things that we, you know, that people perhaps don't consider at times, or maybe they do, and as you said, there's that trepidation of technology in general, is that we talk about things, you know, you mentioned security, there's mobile devices, there is, you know, the management of that corporate asset scenario. You know, you mentioned, you know, there's everything from thumb drives to Dropbox to, you know, who knows what, as far as the technology that can be applied to the management of this. So give me some insight, if you would, just on that risk. Like, what are the things that people experience or maybe should be looking for when it comes to the you know, that side of the management and the risk factors of document records management?
Right, and it definitely depends on the organization. So, I mean, we have customers who have very obvious risks, and those are that they have to be compliant with some set of standards. Now, you know, that could be Federal Government of Canada standards, it could be Sarbanes-Oxley, it could be PIPEDA, you know, ISO. There's some set of standards that they have to manage their information according to, and they already feel that they cannot. Sometimes they're even given deadlines that they have to comply to. So I think the most obvious risk for many of our customers is simply, you know, there's some set of standards that they're obliged to follow. as part of their corporate mandate, and they can't. So that's obviously a big one. Related to that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of e-discovery and litigation that's appearing more and more. Legal cases are often decided by what's in an email or what is in a document. You know, what the decision making was around that information, and that used to be a paper records story, and so it was very clear to records managers how they would track this information, how they could store it, how long it would take before they could dispose of those boxes. They now have to apply many of those same procedures to electronic documents, but obviously it's much easier to make copies of these documents. It's not always clear which is the latest version. So I think e-discovery and litigation is definitely a risk. There's a risk from an IT perspective, from a storage issue perspective. The way that people right now are not sure when they're supposed to get rid of their files, they tend to be very conservative and not delete them at all. So when you talk about retention and disposition, which are good information management policies, most organizations who don't really have a handle on this will only retain. They're not going to dispose. So storage costs increase over time. It can be a problem when you're trying to back up all this information. These documents are sent by email, so now people are clogging up their inboxes. These are all risks that IT would be worried about. Plus security. I mean, you mentioned mobile devices. You know, we work with customers who have extranets. They're not sure how to share this information securely, when this information can be disposed. I mean, these are risks as well. And then there's some less tangible ones. Corporate memory. A lot of people are retiring now. You know, who knows where their information is? Has that been shared with their colleagues? You know, which is the latest version of the information that they were working on. It's not clear how people can find this, and so you have a huge loss to the organization when these people exit. And also the general day-to-day. I mean, if you're trying to find a file that you're working on with a colleague, again, you tend to go into your email and poke around and try to find it. So these are all really risky and challenging things that most organizations are faced anyway. I mean, they're already paying these costs.
And you brought up a really interesting point, because that's one of the things that honestly I never thought about. When you look at it from a generational perspective, you know, we read every day now, especially, you know, in the federal government in Canada, you know, I'm using air quotes, but the quote-unquote baby boomer generation is now coming to the end of their careers. They're, you know, they're moving on to retirement scenarios, and you're talking about a generation that saw the before and the after of even sort of the technological boom. And I know personally people that to this day, you know, even in regards to federal government or private sector, whatever that may be, is that the way that they manage files and how they perceive files and things is that, you know, they still, even in their own homes and basements, have like boxes of of documents, you know, that they've collected over the years from work. So it's, you know, that's kind of an interesting scenario just unto itself, and how to bridge that gap.
Yeah, and there's also a related technical issue of corporate knowledge. And so one of the things that we don't really think about is over the last decade, let's say, the format, the technical format in which these documents were created, whether it was, you know, Word 2003 and then Word 2007 and then 2010, or, you know, Word Perfect or something else. These keep changing, and so it is possible. I know this is something that the Library of Congress in the U.S. is concerned about. For example, it's possible that over time, even if we collect this information, you know, manage it appropriately, if we don't have it in a format that's going to continue, that's going to have longevity, that an organization could discover that, you know, a few years go by and suddenly they can't open files that they needed from 10 years ago. So there's even little decisions around that put organizations under pressure, because they don't have any good way of collecting this information and being confident that they're going to retain it. And this is such value to them. I mean, this is their history. This is important decision making that was made. So I think that those are concerns as well.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because I know that, you know, in my most recent move, I found a box full of diskettes, and, you know, I looked at it. I don't even have the machine to open this anymore, let alone I have no idea what file types were even on there from, you know, 10, 12, 15 years ago. So it's, you know, what does happen to that. So now let's talk about, because I think this, you know, plays very well into this next topic, is that, you know, just because you build a document records management system or solution doesn't necessarily mean that people will use it. And, you know, there's that old saying that, you know, what is it? You can lead a horse to water, but you have to be strong and determined to drown it. Is that is that how it works? Right. So, you know, in your opinion, how? Because we talk about everything from, you know, the generational aspects. Let's even talk about the habitual aspects, right? Is that we all know that, you know, human beings in general are habitual by nature, and people have their work habits, and change is sometimes it could be a scary thing, or it could be just something that just people just don't want to deal with. So if you do build this document records management solution that is the all-encompassing best solution, how do you get people to partake in it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first thing to realize when it comes to document and records management systems in computing, that people tend to live in their email, and they tend to live in their Word documents or their Excel documents. They don't really want to go to a website or a system and have to enter certain information, and it's not really what they're expecting to do. So it has to be very intuitive for them, to do this from where they expect to be, from their emails, or as I mentioned, or their Word documents when they're creating these things.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of organizations, have rolled out document and records management systems in the past that weren't really well adopted because it wasn't a really good user experience. People keep saying, what's in it for me? And the reality is, if they have a daily job that requires them to do certain tasks, and they have to do that by email or Word, they'll do that. But if an extra overhead is in there, if they have to enter more information, or they have to, save it in a certain place, and they have to figure out where to put it, and they don't really know how to do that, and it's a very poor experience, if it's slow, then they're definitely not going to do that. So that's something that you definitely have to put into effect, something that's very intuitive and easy for them, and that they really feel that they're getting something out of it. Now, that something could be that there's a great search engine. It could be that they find information very easily. It could be that they no longer have to worry about, which is the latest version. It could be that they're able to quickly share information with their colleagues and know that it's managed securely. I mean, these are all things that you'd want to consider. And
So
what
really
I would say is that,
user
sorry, Scott.
interface.
Yeah, definitely that's important. Definitely the user interface and the user experience. It has to be intuitive, or they're not going to do it. And the other thing I often see is we see a lot of organizations at the beginning of one of these projects, they really want to mandate the use of the system. They want to make sure that people are going to follow it by policy. And we don't find that works very well. If you tell people to do something and it's not a very good experience, they're definitely going to find a lot of ways around it. I mean, you mentioned thumb drives before, and they can save to their desktop. So you can definitely get around a system you don't want to use.
Right, and it's, well, that I guess that's a great segue into the next topic, right? Is that when we talk about this scenario, is that now you have, again, it's, like we talk about trying to get people to use it, and then now it's the how do you govern that? And as you said, I mean, I think a lot of companies perhaps have this, well, if we just mandate it into place, it'll automatically happen, and that's not necessarily the case, because again, it comes back to sort of that habitual nature of people and saying, look, you can mandate this all you want, but I'm more comfortable in doing my job, and this is how I perceive myself as being, that how I do my job well and how I'm productive and the like. And, a lot of the times people tend to ignore the corporate rules. So if you could explain, I guess, that role of corporate governments and the reasons behind it, and how do you implement a policy that's going to work? Because it's one thing to have it on paper, it's another thing to see it work in real time.
Absolutely, and I definitely don't want to suggest that corporate governance isn't key. I mean, I think it's vital that you do have policies and procedures. They have to be clear to the users. Obviously, it has to be an intuitive system. I mean, we just discussed that, but you definitely have to have a framework, almost a help or support network in place, which is really what this corporate governance concept is. If you do that, if you clearly communicate to everybody in the business why this is important to the business, if you clearly communicate what is the right way to proceed, and what are even better ways, some best practices that can be followed, if you make it really easy for them to ask for help when they use the system, if you make it very clear what the roadmap is, so what things are going to be added, if you make it very clear what is acceptable in terms of making changes and what isn't, these are all things that really help with adoption, and that's really critical. So you definitely have to have corporate governance. In fact, it's usually one of the first things we suggest when you want to set up a system. And essentially what you're doing is you're setting up a committee or a couple of teams that will be responsible for the overall decision making, and they have to have executive buy-in. I mean, there has to be an understanding at the top levels that this is important to the business. They help with the establishment of things that are important, like the information architecture, the taxonomy, which is the way you're going to organize your information, standards for development and change management for security, when you can publish information and where. That's all stuff that the governance committee or the governance structure would have to put into play. But then, of course, just because you have a set of standards, as you mentioned, doesn't mean that people are going to follow those.
So, well, and again, I guess that perfect segue into the next topic is that, so say for instance, okay, we have this, we've implemented something, we have a policy, but there has to be a way to apply numbers to this and to apply, I guess, a measurement in a way that so that you can manage it. And so, from a reporting perspective in analytics, how exactly does that work, say, for instance, within in a SharePoint environment?
Sure. Well, the first thing is, I think it's the sentence there. If you can't measure it, you definitely have to have statistics. You have to have metrics. So the very first thing that one of the jobs of the governance committee is to determine what the success measures are for this system. Because how long does it take me to find a file now as opposed to before? How easy is it for me to make sure that proper security has been applied? How much content am I now using from this system as opposed to from the file share? These are all things that you have to define, and it varies based on the organization, but then you have to measure those on an ongoing basis. So SharePoint itself has a lot of measurement capabilities. It can tell you how much content is in which locations. It can tell you when people viewed a file or when they edited it or deleted it or downloaded it. It can do all of that if you want. And there's also a lot of third-party products that enhance those capabilities, and they might present you with a dashboard that explains that your site that you just launched is getting a lot of activity, and this many new documents have been created. You can have products that tell you that these files have been retained for this number of years and now they're being deleted. And you definitely need to have these ongoing reports. And I suggest that the governance committee and the framework has to be looking at these reports on a regular basis to help them determine whether things are actually going according to plan. And I would also suggest doing health checks on a regular basis just to the infrastructure itself.
Right, and so basically what you're saying is that, if you take this into context, I guess these metrics can give you those, as we look back at just even some of the topics we covered, including, sort of the governance and user adoption things, it's these type of analytics that you can use as, we'll say, action items in the sense of ensuring that this is sort of a continuing, scenario that people are actually able to see it in real time and understand what's happening so that it doesn't become that lost project, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely, and you definitely want to be measuring this because, again, a document and records management system, you probably already have one in any organization that you're in. It may not be a very intuitive or easy thing to do. It could be that email. It could be those paper records. It could be the things that are on the file share. But right now, you're probably not measuring how those are being used, whether proper security is being followed, whether you're compliant. It's very difficult to do that in those kinds of systems. And I think because this touches everybody, if you don't have these measurements, you don't know what success looks like, you'll never be successful.
No, that's a great point. And if we look at, again, let's look at, the history of document records management is that I think in this day and age, with this advent of the information age in general is that there are checks and balances and measurements and KPIs addressed at every level of an organization. And if you look back at, even these scenarios to this day, I go to offices and you see the rows and rows and rows of filing cabinets. You see, people that are leaving the office, even in this day and age, with files within their briefcases at night. We also, even certain things that, Nick, you and I have talked about offline is that, the concept of the consumer products that seem to now, I'll say leak into the corporate world, but they're streaming in at high speed now with everything from mobile devices to personal laptops to those type of things. And it's, with that scenario, is this measurement possible? Like if this is set up in the appropriate way, do those, at least from an IT perspective, are those measurable as well when you're looking at, sort of the mobility aspect of document records management?
Yeah, they definitely can be, and that has to be considered. That's a big new trend, and it's only going to get get more important, but that can definitely be managed from SharePoint, and there's also products that assist with that as well. So that can certainly be handled.
Excellent. So now let's discuss. We've covered quite a bit of ground already this morning in the first 20 minutes of this webinar, but let's talk about how does a company get there? Because I think this is a fairly daunting kind of scenario, right? Is that we can talk about corporate governance, we can talk about all these different aspects of understanding how to get people to use all these wonderful tools, but it's that journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. So if you could explain to the listeners, like, what are the steps that they should take to move in the direction of getting a SharePoint solution implemented so that they can maybe breathe a sigh of relief and increase that productivity and those type of things and not have to worry about some of the subjects we've discussed?
Sure. Again, there's a lot of details, obviously, but I think at a high level, you're always going to follow the same steps. I mean, to start with, you really need to do a content inventory. You need to figure out whether, what's on your file systems, what is on your website, what is in your FTP sites, what is in your email. That has to be the first step because that really tells you what the scale of the challenge here is. Then you need to look at your requirements overall for document and records management. Now, these are often very well defined elsewhere. I mean, you don't want to really reinvent the wheel when it comes to these systems. But, I mean, you definitely want to define what your requirements are because this is an enterprise system ultimately. I think you need to set up a governance framework. So set up a committee, come up with these policies and procedures at the same time. It's never too early to start that. Then you need to create your information architecture and your taxonomy. So what information do you have? You already know that from the content inventory. Now, how are you going to structure that in a way that's very intuitive for your people, for your business units, maybe for partners or clients? How are you going to classify that information? So, what's a memo? What's a policy? Are you going to put information, metadata, to help find these files later based on, the project name or based on the client name? These are all things you need to define. You need to document. And then you need to figure out your retention and disposition rules. So are you going to keep everything for 7 years and then delete it? Are you going to keep it some things for 5 years and some things for 25 years? Is there an approval process? All the things I mentioned you have to do, I think, to really get going, but you still haven't picked a system. You haven't picked a platform. I mean, we use SharePoint 2010. We love it. It can definitely do all of these things. Mm-hmm. But you'll notice that these points don't require you to go with any particular platform. But you also have to, again, consider how intuitive this will be for the users. And I think what really sells SharePoint and makes it shine is that at the end of the day, all this functionality will be in there, but people will still be able to easily do this from their Outlook email or from their Word. It's a very intuitive process.
And I know that you guys, it's interesting because, if I look through your website and I understand what your company does in that sense, you have a very interesting and unique approach as far as implementing the SharePoint scenario as well, because it's, you guys are obviously, you have sort of your three facets of what you do, and it's you have that strategic portion where you can plan out all of the things that you spoke about, and then you have that scenario which you can actually build it and make it happen. Then you actually have, which I think a lot of people don't consider as well, which is the support aspect after the fact.
Absolutely, and I think that those are the final steps you definitely want. Once you're implementing this, and I think you should always do, it's an enterprise system, you should always look at prototypes, a lot of beta testing. You need to provide a lot of user training and ongoing support. So even after you go live, you definitely need to want to make sure that people feel supported, they feel encouraged to use the system. It's easy for them to do that. If they run into any issues, they know who to talk to.
Right. So now we're coming up on, we've got about 7 minutes left, and so we're going to open up the slide deck here in the presentation to the listening audience and get some questions. We actually already have some questions coming in. So, Nick, I have one here for you, and this is actually a very good question. Is setting up a new enterprise system really going to help me with storage and backup problems?
Absolutely. Great question. So, okay, here's the question. If you are taking all the data that's currently disordered in email and disordered in file shares and disordered in FTP sites, and you jam it into a new enterprise system, whether it's SharePoint or anything else, you definitely will not be removing your storage and backup problems. But as part of this content inventory and the setup, you should really be looking at which information you really need to keep. SharePoint itself, as an example, we're talking about SharePoint as a platform here. it will allow you to store this information, remove duplicates. It will remove a lot of the email, the documents that are currently in emails, and it will actually assist with the clogging which is taking place, but only if you apply some discipline, if there's a bit of migration work ahead of time to say, okay, let's put some rules of thumb in here. Let's make sure we're not just taking every single copy of a file that anybody ever sent. Let's make sure we've only got the one. Let's make sure that we're maybe moving things that have been used recently and not things that are older. And you definitely want to start paying attention to that as part of this move. But yes, definitely SharePoint or an enterprise system can have information from these places where they're redundant and duplicated, and causing problems, and cleaning them up and moving only a subset, and then managing that subset in this new system.
Excellent. Well, okay. Thank you for that. So now on to the next question. This is an interesting one because this is one that you and I have discussed time and time again, which is an interesting. How can you balance search and security, allowing people to know information exists and ask for permission to it?
Okay, that's a good question. So speaking about SharePoint, it will actually honor the security permissions on content stored within it. So if you do a search as a user and you do not have the rights to view certain files, you won't be able to see those files in the search results or anywhere else. So that's already something that's very secure. And in terms of actually making that information available to people so that they could ask for permissions, you can have a variety of ways to do this. Depending on how the information is organized, you can have a site owner concept. So you can have a location where information is stored and you have an owner of that information, so people can make requests to that person. You could have a situation where you decide to publish certain information to a more open or public area, but only after it's been approved and it's a final version or it's at a level that you're comfortable with. So these are the kind of conversations that you normally have as part of a setup, and this is where document and records management systems really they change based on the organization. There isn't one blueprint because there's a number of different things you can do that really depend on what the business is trying to achieve. But by and large, SharePoint will always respect the security, and so you definitely won't have security problems caused by search with information stored within SharePoint because people won't see what they shouldn't see. But if you do want them to have the ability to request information, that's a conversation with the business.
All right. So now, during this webinar, we've been talking about, we've used the word pain point and frustration probably quite a few times. This is an interesting question because I think from this individual, obviously, I think they've felt a little bit of that pain. The question is, our last attempt at document management got stuck in the taxonomy phase when no one could agree.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes. Taxonomy is tricky because taxonomy really means, again, how are you going to classify your information? And that works at a very high level, but when you extend this ability across the business, when you have a finance team and you have an HR team and you have the legal team and you have IT, it is definitely very difficult for everybody to agree on what this shared metadata is. The way that we normally approach this is we start with a basic set of metadata that is determined with the governance committee. And again, you need people at a high level understanding how the system as a whole is going to be used and how it's going to help the business. So there do have to be some judgment calls made. But what I normally recommend is not going too far down that road. So let's say that you're looking at that organization that I just sort of mentioned, hypothetically, there could be a decision made that there is just a limited set of metadata. It could be the name of the business unit. That's one of the columns that people would enter. It could be the name of a set of projects that are defined. It could be the name of a set of clients. That's about as far as I would take that. And if you need to extend that further, SharePoint's very flexible. It does allow you at the lower levels, at the HR or the IT or in the legal section, to add more metadata, but at a minimum, the base metadata is already controlled centrally. And by limiting the amount of metadata or taxonomy that you do at the beginning, you get much easier agreement. But I definitely agree that you can't move on unless you have an agreement and understanding of what those are.
And I know you guys have a lot of background and experience in that. So, and I know that you have your very stringent processes, how you help your clients.
Absolutely, and I think the rule is keep it simple. I mean, you don't need to boil the ocean. If you can agree on 3 columns to start with and make sure everybody has those, that's often all you need. I mean, we tend to see the same ones over and over. We see department or business unit, we see project, we see client. There may be a couple more, but you don't need to create too many.
All right. So we're coming up on our 30 minutes. We've got one last question here we're going to field, and this is an interesting one because you mentioned this quite a few times, is that if we look at the habitual nature and how people work, email is such a huge thing still to this day, right? Is that everybody lives and breathes out of their email. It can be everything from their to-do list to where they store files half the time. So the question is this: what about email? We are a large organization that is struggling with actually moving forward on records management. We've been talking about it forever, but we always get caught up in the details around how to handle email. Do most organizations manage emails as records?
Good question. So the answer is no, most do not. Now, we work with a lot of government clients, and emails are considered records. Business decisions are being made based on those. They have a mandate, therefore, to treat emails as records. We have other clients who are in the private sector who may decide, well, we'll just start with, basic documentation, but, we're not going to worry about emails yet. The reality is that SharePoint is a platform. Now, we haven't really talked about what that means, but it means that a lot of third-party products and extensions have been built on top of it. So it's very easy using SharePoint to send emails to a dedicated location where they can become records. It will even take the attachments that are part of that email and move them into that library. There's add-ons which allow you to mark something as a record directly from SharePoint, from Outlook, for example.
Okay.
So if you're a user and you're sitting and you're looking at your email and you decide this is a corporate record, you could flag it as such, and it would be automatically stored in SharePoint, and the appropriate retention disposition rules are in place. And to be honest, we have customers who do both those things. We have customers, I think everybody will end up in this boat eventually because they are understanding more and more that emails are actually records. And therefore, I think everybody will end up in this place. But right now, I see that it tends to be the government clients who do this the most.
Excellent. So now, we're at the end of the webinar, but this is not truly the end. Because we've obviously covered a lot of high-level material today. I think, thank you so much, Nick, for answering these questions, because I think, let's face it, I mean, this is a daunting task for, a lot of people, and when you're talking about something that's going to affect an entire organization, it's not something that you just make a decision on, in minutes and, pull the trigger on it, so to speak. So you guys have been nice enough to also offer a live demonstration. And what we're going to be doing is we have the contact information. We have a gentleman at StoneShare by the name of James Mahoney. His contact information is here. And please, everyone that's listening, feel free to contact James. We can set up a live demonstration for you so that you can see how this works in real time. So we can even go back to perhaps some of these questions during the webinar, some of these, the aspects of how we can even see some measurement type of scenarios, everything in real time, so you can get a better sense of what's in front of you and how this actually works. So I guess at this point, we'll get, if you're listening and watching, write down the information below, and thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. And Nick, thank you so much for your insight on this. We greatly appreciate it.
No problem. I enjoyed it, and these were some great questions, so happy to answer those.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and we hope you have a great weekend.
Have a good weekend.
Thanks.